You're listening to Content Logistics, a podcast for B2B marketers looking to build a content engine that drives revenue. In each episode, Camille Trent interviews the marketers behind the best content marketing flywheels and uncovers the tactical aspects of content production, from first draft to first customer.
Welcome to the holiday edition of Content Logistics. I'm your host, Camille Trent, and there is nothing about this episode that makes it a holiday edition, except for it being December. So this episode is brought to you by my good friends Tristan and Justin over at Motion. They are an agency that helps busy B2B tech marketers like myself, probably like you, launch a podcast kind of like this one. They are the reason that I look semi-professional when I do this. So if you've seen any of my clips and promotions, content around this podcast, they are the reason that it looks good. Today, our guest is Stephen Pope. He is the founder and CEO of Content Engine. This is actually his second time coming on the pod, so go back and listen to his first episode after this one. Today, he's going to share how he scaled content production and distribution to 100 pieces per week. Also, fair warning, if you think that I sound nasally and awful in this intro, it only gets worse in the actual episode. I recorded a few days ago when I was sort of at my peak levels of this cold. And hopefully it will go away, but it's probably been the last 2 or 3 weeks. So I'm just still wrestling with it, but the content must go on. So needed to give you that warning, but hopefully you power through it. Stephen, welcome to the show.
Nice to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so this is actually the second appearance, and I think I've had Nick on and maybe a couple other people twice, but I think you're the only person that's gotten a second solo interview. So
cool.
for what that's worth, yeah, I'm going to make some badges afterwards, give out some trophies, and you'll be the first one to get that. All right. So the reason that I'm having you back on here, though, is to talk about content operations, specifically, which is something that you're very good about, and you have created an entire sort of business model around this, but it's also something that you do internally for your own company. So I like that you sort of drink the Kool-Aid, and then you basically just share what you do, on a daily basis and help other people do it. And one of the sort of big hooks that you have on, I think on your LinkedIn headline right now, is the ability to create 100 pieces of content a week. And so I know people will have gut reactions to that, that's way too many, that's dumb, or how on earth are you doing that? And so I think that's a really nice place to start in terms of can you break down what that looks like what types of content that you're creating per week, and then also just backing up and saying why, right? Why did you decide to kind of take this on?
Yeah, so I think I guess just to start, how does that happen? So most of my content comes from just direct to camera, I'm doing a YouTube video where I look in the camera and I'm going through a diagram, talking about something specific, or I'm doing short form vertical videos. And so obviously the long form stuff, whether it's a podcast interview like this, I'm recording it at the same time that you are, so I can chop this up into clips, and I can chop my YouTube videos up into clips. And then, direct to camera vertical videos obviously are just what they are. And those are clips to begin with. So most of my content just starts from video, partially just because it can be repurposed into so many different things. And then from there, just with some simple things of taking transcripts and rewriting those into text posts, and then taking those text posts and, converting those into different types of graphics, is the main way that I hit that, 100 pieces. And I guess it's like a mixture of publishing the same vertical video to a couple different platforms, and then also, transforming it into different types of content. So it's a mixture of, I guess, the 100 pieces is actually 100 pieces of distributed pieces of content to different platforms. And I think the main reason why I started doing it was really, for me, it was a challenge. I mean, first and foremost, I enjoyed that challenge of trying to figure out how to do that. It was just a fun problem for me to solve. And I know a lot of people wanted to do it. And then I've also seen a lot of people have success by, having lots of content across multiple platforms. And, what I noticed for me specifically is that the two primary places where I get revenue from is TikTok and YouTube. I started on LinkedIn, but I kind of abandoned LinkedIn as a primary place for me to generate business for a couple of different reasons. But what I did notice is that even though I wasn't necessarily driving like new growth and revenue from these other channels, what I did notice is that, having that presence on that other platform was still important, because somebody might find you on TikTok or YouTube, but they might mostly hang out on Instagram, or they might mostly hang out on LinkedIn. And so when they go over to that other platform and look you up, you're still there and present, and you can interact via DMs and comments and whatnot, but you might not necessarily be trying to grow there. So I think having that intention of like, where am I trying to grow and what do those platforms require to grow is an important like understanding to have if you're trying to do this, because it's very easy to get distracted and to produce, but it's not necessarily helping you.
Yeah, nice. So to understand like exactly kind of like what listeners will learn a little bit more of those 100 pieces, what are the different formats? Like what are the different kinds? You kind of mentioned it in terms of like the channel, right? Like what's the end goal? Where are they going to live? And then you can sort of back that into what should that content look like? But really like how much of it is video, like, average length? Is there any written content, audio content? How do you think about that?
Yeah, so I don't have like a perfect breakdown, but it's vertical video. It's like long form, horizontal, typical YouTube style content, vertical content that goes out on TikTok, and then actual text posts that are just purely text. And for me, most of those are coming from vertical videos that I just kind of take that idea and just reformat it, rewrite it. And then people on my team will also take those text posts and then they'll convert them into images or graphics or slide decks and stuff like that. So it's really just those main pieces. I'm not doing any audio right now, mostly just because I don't have a podcast. I want to start one, but so I'm not doing any like pure audio that goes out to an audio platform right now.
Okay, nice. And then would you consider your business as, so you sell courses and you may sell consulting too, and just so give the listeners a little bit of background like on the type of business that you run?
Yeah, so right now I'm only selling one product, and that is the content engine database. I have plans for some other stuff, but the content engine database is really a technology product that helps you organize and repurpose and distribute content at the core of it, right? Because when you're starting to create this much content, it just becomes pretty hectic and chaotic to have that many pieces of content around. And, when you're trying to organize your team around all of that and you've got all these different pieces, it just like you won't be able to scale unless you can keep it organized and streamlined. So that's really the only product that I'm currently selling. And for the most part, the people that buy it are, I guess what I would say is the best fit. It's not the only people that buy it, but the best fit are people that are already creating quite a bit of content and they're already experiencing the pains of doing that. And then I have a lot of content agencies actually that buy it, which makes a lot of sense. I didn't realize that at first, but they are some of the best customers because they have to do it, right? They've got all these clients wanting content, and a lot of them are just like busting at the seams, like having all sorts of issues with their team, communication, things getting done, repeated errors over and over again, losing clients, that kind of stuff. So having something that they can just put in and just pretty much solve that problem overnight is pretty valuable to anyone that's creating a lot of content and having a lot of problems from it.
Yeah, I mean, that makes perfect sense to me in terms of, if you have a lot of clients and if your whole business model, right, is like the ability to produce a lot of content, or maybe in some cases agencies that help distribute that content, right? Like you have to have a playbook for it. You have to have sort of like a template for it to be repeatable. And so I've found that I've like started gravitating toward you and like other agency owners that, talk about their process, because they tend to be a lot better at this, like than your average like in-house marketer, content marketer that hasn't been forced to do this for multiple clients, or hasn't been forced into like this volume game maybe in B2B. So part of the reason that I asked you for this backstory is for people to understand like, who is this best for? Like, how does this apply to me? And so that's kind of my follow-up question is, how important do you think that this process is for your average like B2B SaaS marketer, right? And like, in which ways is it applicable?
Yeah, I think it can be, there's a fine line, because if you haven't really started to create much and you don't really know how to do it and you're just trying to get your voice and get on camera, I think there's some value in just focusing all of your attention on that. Because I will say that like technology can be a little bit of a rabbit hole, and you can definitely get distracted. You might, and if you're a technical kind of person, you might actually have fun doing it. And so you can find yourself kind of just over engineering the process. I mean, I've certainly been guilty of doing that myself because I am an engineer. I've been a victim of that as well. Now, I will say that I do have quite a few clients that are already creating, they're good writers and they're creating content. They might not necessarily need the system, but they kind of have a vision for where they're going and they know that they want to produce more, and they can already kind of see the signs of like what this will look like if they don't do something. So I think having a little bit of awareness of where you are. So like if you know how to make content, you're able to get clients from it and you want to scale and you have a vision, and then I think it makes sense to have it. But if you don't already have some sort of process going that's already successful, then it's hard to automate it, right? It's hard to automate something that doesn't exist yet.
Yeah, I heard a lot of good things from there, because you said earlier in this episode that it's best for people who are already creating like a high volume of content, right? And so because they can instantly see like how to use it. I mean, that makes sense. But then the other side of it is, people who are wanting to get ahead of things, right? Like they're seeing like the next few steps. They're like, okay, this is working for me right now, but if I ever want to scale, and this, directly applicable to agencies, but also directly applicable to most like B2B SaaS businesses, especially VC funded ones, right? Where it's like, yeah, your team, like maybe 10 people right now, but it's not out of the question for it to like triple or quadruple next year, right? It's all based on, if you raise another round of funding, like there's a good chance that like they want to see that team expand. They want to see you double and triple output as well, right? And so seeing what like the next challenge is going to be and sort of like getting ahead of it. And the next thing you mentioned is like that over engineering thing, which I can kind of relate with in terms of like there are times, but I think this is helpful, where even before you introduce automation or Zapier, it's like, what is like the manual version of this process? And so for me, for times that I've had to play this volume game a little bit, it's just like good foldering, right? Like it's just like foldering that makes a lot of sense. And then, watching some of your content, it's like, yeah, now you're just automating like that foldering, right? But like, as long as like you set up the places, like the house for each of these things that make sense, right? So that the average person, like if they were to click on that first folder, like they know how to get to the next folders that they want, right? Yeah. And so,
I mean, at the core of it, that's probably the most, like if you were talking about like where you get a lot of the value from, just having that, right? Because creating all the folders and then linking all those folders so that you can then find them easily, search it, repurpose it later, find it later, that's going to be like where a lot of the value really is.
Yeah, that's great. So I was thinking too about, we talked before this episode about impact of pieces, and you kind of alluded to this too. I'm curious about, you mentioned YouTube, I think YouTube Shorts or TikTok, wherever that vertical video is going. And then you also mentioned LinkedIn, and kind of like rethinking like where to put more of your energy, right? In terms of like which channels are working the best for you. So this I see being like directly applicable to anyone, but especially marketers, of like evaluating channels and like where to spend the most time. So maybe just walk me through the process of like why take your foot off the gas there and rethink the channel. And then people, I think, can think, oh, that's applicable to me, or my situation's a little different.
Yeah. So for me, it's like a truly personal thing. Number one, I made a lot of video, and like video content just isn't pushed as hard on LinkedIn. Like they don't, like I can go to YouTube, I can make a long form video. Maybe every video doesn't get a ton of views, but the views last a long time. Like the content is way more evergreen. So I have videos that just continue to rack up views over time. And then the same was, I got onto TikTok fairly early, and the same was true there too. I could make a video and get hundreds of thousands of people to see it. And I could never do that on LinkedIn. And I just kind of personally, like, I didn't like LinkedIn. I didn't like the things you had to do, or at least, it's just like, there's a lot of just like cross talk. And again, this is like my personal take on it. And it just, I didn't like it. It's not that it's not a good channel to be on, or if you like that kind of thing, then so be it. But I liked creating and having people see it and then book calls with me. I didn't really like creating and doing all that networking and all that stuff that kind of is required. Now, I do think, again, this is like pretty subjective. There are people that do it right, and then there's kind of people that kind of, there's the whole engagement kind of pods and stuff like that. But for me, it just kind of was just more personal. I just liked creating and then getting business from it. And it was harder to do that on LinkedIn. You had to do the whole networking thing. And I just didn't like it as much.
Yeah. I mean, that makes perfect sense to me. I think like choosing channels, a lot of times, like, where is your audience, obviously? And it's probably multiple channels, right? And so to narrow it down more, it's like, what are you good at and what are you not going to sort of burn out on too, right? And so,
right.
And that applies to the whole team too. It's like, what talents do you have on the team and where can you win, right? Like, where do you have that competitive advantage, right? And so I think regardless of where people are at, that's, yeah.
Yeah. And on that note, going to TikTok isn't going to be any easier, but if you like to like come up with hooks and like strategize your videos and make them better, and then you can win, right? Whereas on LinkedIn, you have to have a different strategy where you're networking and you're getting seen through all these different comments you're making and these insightful comments that you have, and you're also making content at the same time. So yeah, for sure, like it definitely comes down to, you know, like what you want to do. I would say like on most of these channels though, it's like your audience is there. It's just that how do you reach them and what do you have to say on that channel to get their attention? That's the only real thing. It's just that when people aren't having success on a channel, it's most likely just because however your audience is showing up to that channel, you're not able to reach them, you know? I mean, that's ultimately what it comes down to.
Yeah, you brought up a good point too of it's not necessarily that it's less time. That's kind of what you said. Like, it's not that it's less time. It's that it's different. Like it's different things that you're doing with that time, right? And so you have to sort of think about which things give me energy, right? Like which things are sustainable for me. And that's kind of what I'm hearing for this too, is like, yeah, like you could do more of like the networking part of it, right? And the community engagement part of it and stuff. And you know what you need to do, right, to be successful on LinkedIn. And sometimes that's not the problem. It's a matter of like, yeah, which things like give me more energy and are like more sustainable for me to do like over and over again, because for any of these channels, like you have to do it over and over again, right? And that is like the volume piece of this, like is building a community or like building something, right? Like you need to have some consistency. And so which channel can you be the most consistent on is something that I hear.
Right.
Too.
Yeah, exactly. And you know, like if you can't have fun doing some of this, then it's going to be hard to do, especially if you're not seeing results, right? I think if you're seeing results from something, that's always going to give you some momentum. Yeah, but if you're just showing up to a platform day after day after day and not seeing anything, then, you know, it's going to be hard. But then, you know, it's just like, and then when I started dealing with video, there were so many little, and then trying to scale, there were so many little fun problems for me to solve as an engineer that's what helped sustain me and keeping me going, and then creating a product around it and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I've seen that with my own life too, I guess, or like career of needing to have different challenges, right? And like knowing that if I don't have that, then I may not do as good of work, just because like there's not like the inherent like I need to solve this problem, and it's more like this needs to get done this week, but it's maybe anyone can do it, right? And so feeling like you're exclusively better at like to solve this problem, right? Or that you're valued like to solve this problem in a way that someone else maybe couldn't.
Yeah,
sort of keep you going.
I mean, and that's partly what makes my product successful, is that there's really nothing else on the market that's doing this right now, and there's a passion to it. So I think unless you're like a sociopath where you can just pretend to be something you're not, I think your passion has to kind of come through on social media to a certain extent. Like there's like kind of a mixture of things that make it work. And I think passion is one of them. It's not the only thing that makes it work, right? You have to actually help people and get people results and like have a good product on the back end that people talk about. But that passion coming through is something that definitely people latch onto, and it helps you cut through the noise to a certain degree. And especially if it's a crowded market, you know, in terms of what you're selling.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely feel like I gravitate toward people who are passionate about something. And I guess that's the fun of interviewing, right? Is even if I completely disagree like with the take or what they're passionate about, or I have like zero interest in it, it's like fascinating seeing what people are passionate about and the types of things that they think up that are not on my radar at all, right? Like that's what I think is fascinating about interviewing and about like seeing how people grow and found businesses. Okay, so follow-up question to all of this of just what you do, the 100 pieces. We talked about the different types of pieces. I'm interested in like the impact of those pieces too. So again, like I know this was part of the equation in determining which channels, like which types of content. And so which types of pieces are like the most impactful to revenue, and maybe there's other ones that are more impactful for, you know, community and engagement. How do you think about measuring those things?
Yeah, so I mean, for me, like in like just being frank, like the biggest ones are the vertical videos and the YouTube videos. I don't know that my text posts right now or my graphics do a lot for the revenue side of things, other than to help me kind of understand how these things are created and how they're organized and help my product. So that's one distinction for me that other people might not have, is that sometimes I'm just experimenting to like learn how to do these things so that I can help other people do them. Where their text or where their graphics are more impactful, I can still help them kind of think these things through and break it down and gain the experience on how to do some of this stuff. But for me, it's like, it's all in the video. Yeah, I get lots of people from, and YouTube is growing. That's where I'm getting a lot more as well. It's like, so I'm about to hit like, I think 4,000 subscribers, and I don't know what it is about YouTube, but when somebody finds you there, there's just a lot of credibility that comes from that. So it's the short form vertical video and the long form videos that drive most revenue. And then email has become a little bit more of a driver. So I think I'm about to hit like 5,000 subscribers there. And once I started to hit that level, I started to get more people, like you responded to one of my emails, right? It took a while for that channel to do anything for me.
Yeah, no, that kind of makes sense to me, because video and email, especially newsletters, like are more intimate in a way. Video's obvious because you can see the person. I think with like AI being more saturated, like, or more adapted now, like you're just gonna have the ability to just create more written content, right? But like more crappy written content, kind of.
Yeah.
And so I think like that will give video kind of like a premium in a way, right? Because you can see that it's like a real person, you know, until we get to like sophisticated deep fake videos, right?
It's funny that you mentioned that, because I just saw one yesterday from somebody and I was like, wow, it was pretty good. And
Video?
yeah, like it was probably one of the better ones I've seen. He made the video and said that it was a deep fake.
Okay.
So I knew what it was, but I might not have known. It was
yeah, I mean, I've seen like those like trailer mashups too, you know, like where they could take, and it's like fair, like somewhat subtle, like in some cases, right? So we'll get there. Yeah.
I think in the end though, like, so what I've noticed in my whole social media career, first and foremost, is that like, I think what really is more sustainable is like when you have a good product, that's like, that is actually like one of the biggest long-term drivers. Like you can fake it for a while. Like you can create things and create hype around things and sell things. But I think having a good product is going to be the thing that kind of helps, you know, like fight against some of all that, because I think it will be pretty messy for a couple of years, like with all of the content that AI is going to generate. But I think good insights and saying smart things and things that really matter are going to be the premium. And it'll be hard not to get distracted by all those things you could do with AI and stuff, and just staying focused on, you know, communicating really well and, you know, giving those insights to people that really help them and that kind of thing.
Yeah, it's interesting because I've been trying to figure out like the best way to communicate this thought that I had, where it's like the old school way to advertise or to, you know, promote a product or to market, however you want to think about it, was like you had to buy the real estate. You had to buy like the space to like put your billboard up, right? So you're buying like the media, and that still exists, right? You can buy spots, like ads, like on any type of channel, right? We talked about newsletters, so like ads and newsletters, like you can still borrow like someone else's digital real estate, and that's still like a way to market. But like the organic way to do this is like you really just like market content or market a product with more content, like in a way, right? And so I think about this as like, if the whole way to do it is to like extract a piece of the product, whether it's just like showing some context of like how to use the product, right? Or like what to use it for. There's that sort of like method. Or like you have this long form piece of content and you're just basically taking like a clip of it, and that becomes like your promotion, basically, that like becomes just kind of like the daily thing that you do to like beat the drum on this. Like both of those things are just extracting like from the product itself. You're just like taking a piece of it and that's what you're using to market it, right? And so it's just like this content inception thing. And so that's like what's really different about this. It's not about like buying the space anymore. Like I think that kind of advertising and marketing has become less effective, and it's more about like, if your product is actually good, like prove it and give me like the simplest, quickest like explanation and walkthrough about it.
Yeah, and then also I think having this is going to be a new skill, but I guess that community building skill where there's like this something that you build even around that type of content that's a little, I don't know, I wouldn't necessarily say it's broader, but it's helping pull people together around a certain topic, and then your product just happens to kind of be in the middle of it, and so people get more exposure to it. But yeah. I think like your ability to kind of entertain people, and I don't necessarily mean like a comedian, but like in some way, like you're able to kind of, we've talked about this before, but like having a media company, like starting to learn how do you create content that people actually want to watch, even if it doesn't necessarily relate to your product. And it's always going to depend, right? So like the more niche your product is, the more differentiated it is, the easier it is, I think, to talk about your product more, because it's just so different or so new, and it just stands out. So people are interested in it. Like it was always easy for me to just show my Airtable database and people were just like, oh, that's kind of cool. Like I've never seen that before. Right. But if it doesn't have that, then I think the more you can make community around things, and then it gives you an advantage.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Like it's community, like, and content together, like and there's data to back this up. Like at my last stop, Pure Signal and KeyPlay, like we did a lot of this like data around like what works in go-to-markets and in marketing. And basically you're seeing like a lot of the like Cloud 100s, a lot of like the impressive companies like doubling down on community, like hiring more community people, like owning their own community, right? And then same with different like content trends as well, like podcasts and things like that. Like there's more companies that are doing well, that are doing these things more often, if that makes sense. And I kind of boil it down to like catalyzing conversation, maybe, right? Because you can do that through really good content, right? Like you even mentioned, like it can be visual, right? It can just be like, here's like a quick look like at my Airtable database, right? And if you show that, it can just like catalyze like this like conversation where people are like already messing with Airtable, right? Or they're messing with like their current project management system. They're like, oh, I can see like how this would improve my workflow, right? And so you're sort of catalyzing like conversation through that content. And then, same thing with community, right? Like you're not necessarily creating content in the traditional sense, but like there's a skill to just like getting people together and maybe kicking off like the initial conversation with some sort of like unique topic, right? Of like, hey, what's everyone thinking about this niche area like around AI, and how are you using it for thumbnails or whatever? It's those types of things that just like catalyze the conversation that happens in your community, and you sort of like grow it that way. So I think that is going to become a more important sort of content marketing skill.
Yeah, I think so too. And I think what a lot of people have trouble with is just that, I mean, that's figuring out how to do that it's not easy, right? Like it was never like a skill that I had. Like I'm not a community builder. I'm kind of like an introverted, like technical guy. I want to just build things and like disappear for 6 months.
Yeah.
And like show people and be like, and then everyone's like, oh, that's so cool. That's what I kind of like to do. So people are always looking for these perfect roadmaps of like, hey, how do I do this? How do I get into it? And there are roadmaps and whatnot. And I'm sure if you have tons and tons of money, you can just go to some company and they'll just build you this thing. I think you kind of have to experiment. Like the videos that I made around Airtable, I had no idea. Like I literally just took my phone out and I was just like on the screen, just like moving it around real fast. And like people would even call me and say, I couldn't even see what you were doing, but it looked cool. And so I called you, And so like, I didn't know that was going to work. I just was experimenting. And so I think if you try to put all of this stuff into some sort of process that just gets executed from week to week, obviously process is part of it, but if there's no thoughtful, like sit down and just kind of brainstorm and analyze what we've been doing and how's it working and experimenting with new stuff, then it's hard for it to work. And I think most companies, they're so busy doing all the other stuff that they've already been doing. Like the thought of just like, sitting down and brainstorming and putting time into this other thing, it's just really hard for them to wrap their mind around because they're just so busy. Like I have the same problem. If I sit down and I'm not gonna record an ad or record a video or record a YouTube video and I've got all this other stuff in my brain that I'm supposed to do, like it's almost impossible to be creative. And so like really like buying into like where the world is going, because it's probably only going to get even more intense, right? Like the competition for like this space, this free space that we're talking about, it's going to get more intense. And so like just your ability of just like learning how to do this is going to be really valuable going forward. And so for the people that are kind of putting it off, like there's going to be a rude awakening where they're like, where the people that are creative and creating all this stuff are going to be so far away from where they are, where they're just like, hey, all I've ever done is talk about my product. Like I've only explained my product on sales calls. And so I don't know how to like produce any of this stuff. I don't know how to build a little community and get people to join it and then be active in it. Like that's really important skills to have.
Yeah. The thing that I thought when at the beginning of this portion of what you said was the case for volume, like really is like what I heard is like, you didn't necessarily know that specific execution was going to work, but the fact that you were trying enough executions, enough different things, now you have like the data to be able to like sit back and be like, not only do I think this thing works, but I know that it works better than these other things because I've done enough things that I can compare them. You know what I mean? Like sometimes you don't even know what good looks like because you don't have enough data points, right? And so having tried like different angles and different things, like to me is really just like the case for volume, as long as like you know what you're trying to say. And this is where I think some people skip this step, and we can get into like this kind of slides into the next thing I was going to ask you, but of the challenges that the content marketers run into when they're trying to scale, right? The big thing that I harp on is like you're trying to scale something before you have anything to scale, right? So you do have to figure out like, what is it that I'm trying to say? Like, what am I good at? Or if you're working for a company, like, what do I want to be known for, right? And then what skills do we need to gain to be able to like talk about that credibly? And usually you need like a subject matter expert, or you need to yourself become a subject matter expert. So you need that. You need like the good content. You need to know what the message you're trying to communicate. But then it is kind of a matter of like volume, because it's like you don't know like what's going to stick, and you can have all of these different like theories about it, but ultimately you do need a little bit of volume, because I'll need to hear it a specific way. And I, as the listener or the viewer, I might not know how I need to hear it, if that makes sense. And you won't know that until you do it.
And you could think about volume on multiple platforms as just even on one platform. So like, if we were just talking about LinkedIn, like some people might only log in on Sunday afternoon. And if like, so you have to have that daily volume. That's like, I think there are people that do less than that, I'm sure are okay. But like, I think that is kind of that's like a requirement essentially, is like one post a day that like actually does something meaningful. And like you said, like there's all these different types of buyers, like there's some that there's different types, and they want to see that they're going to have to see it from their angle. That's why like just sticking to the same topic and just coming at it from different angles over and over again actually works really well. Most people have a problem with that because they're just like, I just said that. And it's like, yeah, I know, say it again. Like just keep saying it, and it works, because people probably didn't read it, didn't digest it. And I see this a lot on LinkedIn, most of all, actually, I would say, is just like random content coming out from people where it's just like, of course you want to have different stories about your life and how that kind of fits into different things and stuff. But I just see a lot of random stuff. And I think that can be really distracting to what you're trying to sell. But I think that's kind of the nature of LinkedIn and how people promote their content with each other. And so people that don't have like, that's why people with like a really strong product, I see less of that, because they're true experts and have a good product. So they're just used to talking about the same stuff over and over again, because that's what they do. And then as you scale out your content to other platforms, people will see that stuff.
Yeah, this is perfect, because this goes into kind of like the sort of backstory, and you can either talk about your backstory or a backstory of, customers or just business people that you talk to, like about the challenges of content operations and automations, right? Of like, what are the things that you see getting in the way the most? And so I'll start it off by just kind of recapping what you said a little bit, because we've talked about this a couple times in the episode of there's a human element to it, of just like, you feel weird about talking about the same thing over and over again, right? And so, or like maybe you're not passionate about that thing and it's hard to like just continually like create a content around it that feels different, right? Or that feels fresh. So that can sort of like slow you down or like make you sort of like doubt your strategy a little bit. So there's kind of like this like human element of it, of just like internally feeling weird about it, and so like not being able to sort of like keep up with it because you kind of like feel burnt out or you're not sure it's going to work. But sort of like what are other problems that you think people kind of run into when they try and scale?
Yeah, and so kind of like, and to back up a little bit, the way I got here is, so I sold a previous company, and then after I sold it, I was just like, okay, I'm going to start at this next one, and I had an idea of what I was going to do. I didn't actually end up doing it, but I started creating all this content. And so that's kind of how I started running into all these problems. But I did see people like Gary Vee and, Chris Walker. I know you know Chris Walker. He's like really, really big on the LinkedIn side, really executed it probably the best way I've seen for like a company. But like, I guess that's what it is. It's like, how do you create the content and do it in some sort of systematic way so you can continue to repeat and talk about the same things and from different angles, right? So obviously there's, sitting in front of the camera and recording or creating a podcast. But I think that the thing that I see is like, so the struggles that I see is like, if you're going to sit in front of the camera and say something, people have the typical, just, I don't look good kind of struggles. I don't feel confident, but then they just run out of ideas, right? So you're going to have some sort of mechanism to help you keep going on that front. And then the other way I see people solve that is like they do a podcast, which is cool too. But I think that could also, but if you start a podcast solely to get clips, I think that can be a problem as well, because there's no real meat to your podcast. And if you're just interviewing people just willy-nilly, then, you might not actually get much of an opportunity to be an expert yourself, and it's your podcast, right? So I think even Chris Walker is a good example of that as well. It's like, he has a podcast, but all of the clips are of him for the most part, right? Like, so he was pretty strategic about that. So he didn't just start a podcast just to get clips, right? Because if you have a bunch of clips that aren't saying anything relevant to your product, ultimately it's not going to work. So there is that aspect of creating. And then once you're creating a lot of content, then how do you organize it all and do it efficiently, right? Because I think there is a certain point where the content makes you so much money. You have so much like momentum behind it that you can afford a big staff. Like the content literally is generating so much revenue that having staff to help you do it and do even more is a no-brainer. But in the beginning, like, you'll probably be spending more than it makes you. And so how can you be efficient with as few people as possible and make it as creative and as scalable as possible? So that was the kind of the problem I thought was pretty cool. How can you maintain creativity, but at the same time continue to try to make it cheap, efficient, and scalable? I find that like those two things go against each other. So it's kind of a fun problem to kind of stick yourself in the middle of and try to work that out. That's why sometimes I do some things that aren't necessarily generating revenue, but I have to kind of figure them out to be the expert in it.
Yeah, you have to invest the time to replicate the problems that that your audience is having, right? Or that your customers are having.
Yeah, and it's truly maddening at sometimes, like it really is, because like it just feels like things are like, especially if you like order and and chaos kind of can bother you a little bit. Yeah. Because like maybe the chaos doesn't matter, like it doesn't really matter, but it can feel so chaotic that it can just feel like, oh man, I don't like the way this feels, but maybe it's okay,
Yeah. No, but I think that that's important to understand like how it feels to everyone else, right? Like if you're a naturally more organized person, and that's why you've been, successful in creating this type of a product, but the people who are less organized, right, are going to be like attracted to this, but you have to like understand what their default is, right? Like, which is probably like not organized, like not as organized as you. And like, they might not have like that same sort of like engineering sort of mindset. And so being able to really understand their pains is good.
Yeah. There are some people though that are just totally turned off by my product. They like, they see it And they think it's like, it must zap all the creativity out of the whole process. Because if you're like a true creative and the content is the only thing that you care about,
right?
You know, I could see why like some people are like, this is like, I mean, I've had these kind of comments. It's like, what you're building is like the reason why the world is a horrible place, you know, like, you know, I guess it is what it is. But
well, that's good. That's good to know too. I mean, either way, you figure out who your audience is, right? Like who's
right.
turned on, who's, you know, likes the idea, who's turned off by it, right? Like where's that kind of like sweet spot?
Yeah, and it does make you think sometimes, you know, like, which I think is a good thing. Like somebody makes those comments and you really have to kind of get centered again. You're like, why am I building this? Like, because I don't want to just be someone that's just pumping out content for the heck of it. Like I want it to make an impact. So I think having that balance, having those opposing thoughts, like there was a lot of people in the beginning when I didn't even have a product, they'd be like, some people would be like, oh, that is so cool. Can I get a copy of that? And then there'd be other people that'd be like, that is so overwhelming. I can't even imagine like doing that. And it was just interesting to process those different things. And I think also like having a good center in your own gut is good too, because like sometimes when I didn't have a product, sometimes those things would sway me back and forth, but I didn't have a product yet. So, or at least I didn't have that technical product yet. So when people would say it's overwhelming, I'd be like, that's interesting. Does that mean it's not a good product, or is it just the wrong person? You know, so like, I guess like learning how to navigate social media and not have it impact you the wrong way is kind of an important skill to develop as well. Cause it can be kind of brutal out there. Like when you're getting all this feedback and you don't really know, if you don't really have your own center, it can really bat you around and push you around in a way that doesn't feel good.
Yeah. Yeah. So going back to the community aspect of this, like it's useful to kind of know which direction to go next or how to evolve the product, maybe like in doses. But like once you decide, like you have to sort of be all in, and it kind of goes back to the like, what is the thing that I could do like every day, like day in and day out, you know, like that I'm passionate enough about and that I know works, you know. And once you have that, like that can help sort of like ground you to be like, okay, there are gonna be people that don't like it, and that's actually a good thing, right? Like there should be sort of like a strong opinion like around this, like from me and from the outside, and there should be people that love it and people that hate it, right? So, and that's just what goes into positioning, right? Like strong positioning. So seeing some of those things as good things, I think is.
I also kind of think like my journey was interesting, at least for me, because like I had several products along the way, all of which, you know, had some success, but it was kind of interesting to literally just build something in public and then build a product out of it. I thought that was kind of an interesting, you might already be an expert, you might already have a product. And I think those kind of people probably have could have the easiest time getting onto social if they just kind of wrap their mind around the best way to do it. But it is kind of interesting that you can just go on to social media and talk about things and just kind of like interact with people and then develop something from it. That's pretty interesting that you can do that. It was quite fascinating to just kind of go through that process.
Yeah, I mean, the instant response, I think, like helps everyone, right? Like instant data, basically, if you think about it that way. Like it's definitely not a bad thing. Okay, another thing I thought about cadence, just as kind of like a couple like pushback questions that are just kind of like not necessarily my opinion, but just like what are going to be like some of the challenges that you face, like, or questions that come up, you know, and people are butting up against like this type of approach or this type of product. And part of it is like cadence. And so for instance, like one theory that I have is like the volume play in general. And I'll use like SEO because, you know, this was like especially popular in like 2010s, and, you know, HubSpot and others like had a lot of success behind it. And it was really like this volume play. Obviously, I think every company can benefit from volume if you can do quality and quantity together, right? Like that's like the perfect thing. I think that lower ACV like type products and like PLG type products where it's like, how do we just get more people signed on or like interested or aware of this thing? Because we need a lot of people signed up because it's, you know, a low monthly cost, right? Or maybe it's like a one-time cost, like a D2C type product. Like those ones absolutely need volume because you just need more customers, point blank. Whereas a higher ACV type product in B2B, like if you're talking about, you know, a 6-figure type deal, like you just you don't need as many customers. You would still like more customers, and it would be great for you to figure out like that volume plus quality equation as well. But I think there's more urgency like on business models that require a lot of customers, right? And often cases that means like there's a smaller monthly cost, right? Like associated with that product. So how do you think about cadence is really the question here. And yeah, like do you agree with kind of like that assessment? Does everybody should everyone's goal, be to try to create 100 pieces of content per week? Or how would you take this model and maybe like transform it a little bit for your average B2B SaaS company?
Yeah, and I think it kind of depends on where you are, right? So like, I think the first step is like, can you make content and then like attribute that content back to making some money? Because you need some of those initial insights as to what people really need to hear before you can do anything at scale. So yeah, if it's a higher ticket, offer, then the buying cycle or the sales cycle is going to be longer. So like, how can you shorten that sales cycle? When people get onto the call, or do they already know something about you? So I think that quality is definitely going to have to be the first and foremost, right? But I will say at the same time, it's like, if you don't, it's always this like catch-22, because if you haven't had any quantity, then getting to the quality is hard as well, right? Unless you're just like a really gifted communicator. There are those types, right, where they just always say things the right way, like they're just gifted that way. Like for whatever reason, they're just able to, they're very empathetic and they're good communicators. So they're just always doing that. But if you don't know how to do that, if you don't really know what your customers want, then you got to figure that out. And like the quantity thing, if that's the goal, then you might sacrifice that quality. Because I always thought it was kind of interesting, like when I developed this product, I figured out what people wanted through the content. So I kept making these things, and then I would get on sales calls with people and they would say, oh, I booked this call because I saw your system, right? And so that was a big insight to me. I was like, well, I'm going to talk more about systems. But then I would also sell the system, and then sometimes I'd have an unhappy customer, and they'd say, yeah, I didn't get the system. And I'd say, I did give you the system. They're like, no, not that system. They wanted this one. And so I kept going deeper onto what even system meant to them, right? So system that means really nothing, right? But they may have wanted a system to generate ideas very easily, whereas I sold them something else, right? So like, I think going deep on what those little things that people need to hear is kind of important. And then that's also going to go back into your product. So I think if you can really envision the way this should work, it's like, it's really just this cycle where you're getting customer insights, sharing information, getting customer insights, talking to people, and making a better product. And then, so like, I think that's truly the way it should be thought, is like this like full cycle thing where it's all integrated. The product development, content, sales, it's all really, it should be like kind of this one like little engine, right? Because if you have good content that gets you customers, but you can't keep them because the product's no good, then you're not really going to scale too far.
Yeah, like the companies that are going to succeed today can move fast, and the reason they can move fast is because they have these feedback loops built in, right? There's feedback loops on like the sales side, right? So you're getting like this real time, instant feedback about the product and like the positioning, and even to what you're saying, like the naming of these things, right? Like, is it the right name or description like for this piece of the product, like where they know what they're getting into, right? So there's the product feedback, but then there's also like the content feedback too, right? Of like, is the content that I'm producing communicating the product well enough, and is it communicating well enough, period, right? Like, do people get it, and are people resonating with it, right? So having that feedback loop as part of the system, like as part of like the content system, like so that you can sort of create better content in the future.
Yeah, exactly. And then is the product team getting all this information as well? Because like what it kind of turns out is like just interacting with you and your product and your content, it's all just an experience. And so I think people try to perfect taglines and perfect these one-off statements, when in reality, when people are experiencing your product, they're not experiencing your tagline. Your tagline is important, but like what they're experiencing is the sum of everything, right? And so really all of these marketing messages, they're they're hitting people over and over again from different angles all the time. You're never going to come up with the perfect tagline that sums up everything. So what you really want is like all of these different things to be interacting with them all the time. A good experience, good messaging, good education, and then better product. Like if you have people that are interested in what you're doing and their feedback is coming back into the product and you're able to turn that out fast enough, then they'll be patient with you. They'll stick around if they see that you're listening and then improving. But if it just goes into a black hole and nobody ever talks to them again, and you can see it like in some of the big SaaS companies, like you can see like even Zapier, for instance, like I've been pretty critical, even though I use them, I've been pretty critical about like when I see their ads, I go in there and I write stuff because it's not aligned with where their product is slowing down. It's becoming expensive and their ads are kind of tailoring to people like you and me who are kind of small, but it doesn't fit because the product's becoming more expensive and it's becoming clunky. And so like there's a discrepancy there that I think ultimately will be their demise over a long enough time period. So, and that might be why like, over the next 10 or 15 years, like we see smaller, more niche companies that are catering to smaller groups instead of creating these huge SaaS models that have these big, evaluations and sell for billions of dollars. Maybe the market shifts to these more like kind of, I'm missing the word, but like niche products that really just kind of cater to them. And it's like more intimate, I guess.
Yeah, like this is fascinating because it all still like goes back to this idea of like kind of like the case for volume to some degree, right? Like the case for showing up every day and like the case for like being known for something, right? And like what you do is more important than what you say is kind of like the big thing that I heard, because I think you could make an argument in like the 1960s or whatever, like Mad Men days, right? 60s and 70s, like where the tagline really mattered because that was like the one interaction like people saw with your brand, right? It's like these billboards on the side of the road or like, something in the mall or whatever. And that is the understanding that I would have about that product, is like they want me to know that like their soda is really bubbly or whatever it is. And so there's like a couple of different like sticky things, taglines, right? Like one-liners kind of, and that's like that's your association with that brand. And now like with social media and just like the internet in general, you have the opportunity, for better or worse, to have so many more like associations like with the brand, both from what the brand puts out themselves and then the people that work at that brand. I think this is like, especially in like B2B where it's very like relational, right? And goes back to sort of like everything you mentioned about LinkedIn. Like those are, again, for better or worse, like interactions that people are having with your brand. And so like if those don't add up to the tag, or boil down, I should say, like to the tagline, then you sort of have this problem, because what other people think that you do is more important than what you say that you do, as much as you say what you do, right? And so like all of that stuff has to align, where I think like the brand guide and the taglines, like those are important internally, so everyone can sort of just be on the same page and kind of like show up in a similar way, right? So everyone can bang the drum on the same kind of like messaging, so there isn't this disconnect. But it's less important, I think, now externally, because like it just doesn't matter. People are just like, just show me, just educate me, right? Entertain me, right? And do that lots and lots of times, right? Do that every day. And like that's going to be way more important to me and impactful than like you coming up with this like one-time cool like execution at a trade show or like this like catchy headline on your website. Like that's not going to go very far for me.
Yeah, and I guess it also might depend a little bit on like the type of product too. Like, everyone's talking about how like Liquid Death, they came up with this cool brand concept, and obviously the concept alone was very successful. So that might matter for like that kind of product a little bit more, where it's like, the price is $4 and it's all about
more transactional products. Yeah, like so yeah, for me, like always trying to bring it back to like B2B SaaS, right? And like how do you actually get someone to like sign a deal for like $100,000 a year, right? Like those types of like bigger deals, because I don't have a lot to lose by like trying Liquid Death, right? Like I got $4
right.
like that I can spend.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, perfect. Well, yeah, I've sort of like we've gone through like some like different avenues that I wasn't expecting that I'm getting like sort of like fired up about, which is fun. But sort of bring it back to some of the logistics around like how do you produce content at scale? One of the big questions that people have is, okay, you're producing all this content. You say part of the system is that distribution. So how do you distribute that much content, period? And how do you do it in a way that like is not overwhelming for people, right? So this is kind of like a scheduling and like spacing it out challenge.
Yeah, so I think obviously there's the auto schedulers, the auto posters, which my product does integrate with, but I find that those don't really help you a ton either because they seem to affect performance of your content. So again, like kind of like going back to what we were talking about in the beginning, like that organizational piece is so critical because posting content isn't actually that big of a deal if when you go to post it, you know exactly what to post and you can click on you can click on the copy, you can click on the image, you can click on the video, and you can just get easy access to it and post it. So you have to have your workflows down. You have to know like, okay, when this type of content comes in, we're going to do this to it. These different things are going to be created. All of these little assets need to go here. Everything and everybody knows where they're going to go. And that's one thing that my system does well is it keeps track of like that, all that incoming content. It organizes it and then keeps track of where it should go. And then when you get to that point where you need to actually post it, everything is there for you to do so. And you also know along the path all of the little pieces that need to get done. And like people know what piece, like what part of the puzzle they fit into. So if you have somebody that makes thumbnails, you know, they know that that thumbnail needs to get created. And so it's all organized so that when somebody goes to post it, number one, you know that it's all done. Every little thing has been checked off, and then they can just download it and post it. So if you have those things, all of this becomes less overwhelming because it's just organized. You know, that's the best way to put it. Because if it's not, then you're searching around for things and you're just like, you're going to hate your life, especially if you're trying to do it at scale. You're like, now I got to go to the next platform. And it's just like, it's such a pain.
Yeah. Like it's this idea of you have to have thought out the entire process from the beginning, right? Like what is the end goal? Where do these things need to ultimately live? And how many people and with what skills, like, do we need to be able to get there, right? So that kind of is a perfect transition into this next question of like, just breaking down the roles on your team, or maybe just like the roles that you think are needed into like an effective, you know, content engine, if you will.
Yeah, I think if you could find, so here's the thing, when you go out to hire, like the way I look at it now is like, I would rather find someone that was passionate about the content space. Like they almost consider themselves content creators themselves. And then them learning the things they need to learn versus going out and finding a video editor, finding this. Because like nowadays, so like if you want super fancy video editing, you still need a video editor. But if you just need the basics, like you need someone to cut it, add subtitles, do these different things, like you don't need a video editor. You can use a tool like Descript. And there's probably other ones as well, like CapCut. I know that one's becoming easier. But if you could find someone that can just do that editing and then can make some graphics in like something like Canva, and then can kind of run the organizational system, and then you can just be the subject matter expert, you could probably do a lot with just two people. I mean, you could create a ton of stuff with two people. But if the subject matter expert it has to do all that stuff, it's going to drain you quite a bit. That might be the place you have to be. But I will say, like, if the subject matter expert could develop a relationship with that one person, maybe we call him like a content specialist, then you guys get a good bond together where like that person starts to really understand your content. Because like one of the comments I always get a lot is like, how do you find someone that's good at making clips? And I'm like, well, I don't know too many people out there that's all they say they do. So like it might be that you have to work with somebody for a while for them to develop the ability to know what you're all about and when to clip it, when to not. There's probably people that are better at it than others, but like you ultimately just want to find someone that's interested in trying to figure out all these little problems and work with you, and you develop a relationship so you can kind of be symbiotic, right? And then it's a tight-knit team. You don't have all these different people. Because if you go out and you hire a video editor and then you hire somebody that does copy and then you hire somebody that does thumbnails and they're not all full-time, like now you got like it's just going to be logistically, it's going to be way harder, right? Like they're going to have other priorities, and like you're only asking for one thumbnail a week or 2 thumbnails. So you're just like a low priority for them. But if you can get someone full time that's just kind of helping you produce all of this stuff, you could easily do 100 pieces a week with one person, you and one other person, easily. That's pretty much what we have.
Yeah. No, I love this answer because it feels like one of the ways that I sort of like fell into sort of like content marketing. I mean, I was always like in content to some degree, copywriting and all of that going into it. But I felt like I had like just mostly soft skills getting into it. And one of those things was just like editorial eye, right? Like, can you identify what good content looks like? And you're right. Like some of that is just like being at a company for a while and figuring out what good content means to them, figure out kind of what you're trying to say and what your point of view is. And you have to have a desire to want to know that, right? So there's that aspect of it. And then there's just kind of like a instinctual thing of just, what makes a good hook, right? And so I'm sort of like in the process now of like trying to reverse engineer some of the things that have worked well for me, some of the things that have worked well for other companies in terms of like what makes a good hook, right? And then what makes good content, right? And like, can I back that into a system? Like going back to the word system, like so that at some point, like later down the road, AI could be good enough to like take all of this information, like all of the types, and goes back to like the case for volume, right? Can I feed it all of this volume and being like, this is good content. These are examples of good content that we've made in the past. And you can use like metrics like likes or shares or whatever to like qualify that, or even like sales, like this is the content that brought in sales for me, right? Like, can I just feed all of that information and then you spit out, like you tell me like what the clips are from them. So maybe we get to that point, but I agree that there's kind of like this stepping stone of like, I'd rather just work with someone with like the desire to learn that, like the desire to find that out and an interest in the topic.
Yeah, because like you can hire video editors and like thumbnail creators, but like the art of creating a YouTube thumbnail, that's like there's some art to it, right? So like your thumbnail ends up being a really important part to your YouTube success, and you might hire somebody to create a thumbnail, but that doesn't mean it's going to work well for you. You can hire a video editor, but is that video editor just going to do exactly what you said, or are they going to kind of add some value to it? So yeah, I think having someone that's really interested in, and maybe even someone that maybe has their own side hustle, so that that they have like they're doing something. I mean, there's always like people I think feel like that's a risk, right? Because now that person might go leave and stuff. But I think that's the economy we're in. So people are jumping ship all the time.
Yeah. Well, and it's a matter of like, you have to realize like what you're bringing to the table, right? Like if you're not offering like full-time job security, right? And like a pension,
right?
Then like you can't expect like people to stick around. And so figuring out like what's that symbiotic relationship look like. And the other thing I'll add to the editing portion of it is, at one point brought out an agency to literally do the edits, right? Like to literally like clip it and give it back to me. But yeah, so I was ultimately like saying, okay, from here to here is what I want clipped. And here's the headline. Like I was kind of like giving all the instructions and then just literally handing it off so that you could make that like video clip, but maybe over explaining like at certain points, because it's like really wanted to understand like what worked and have like a few different copy examples. And yeah, if you put in the time ahead of time, like where you put in extra work basically to show, like lead by example and say like, this is what good content is, like this is kind of like how we define a good clip, right? And so you need enough of that backlog to then show someone else, if you want to kind of onboard someone, of like, this is why it works, right? Like once you have those examples, it's easier to be like, here's why it works, like here's why this headline works, like here's why this is a good clip, right? And you can kind of create that like standard operating procedure for someone else. And so I've always been a big fan of like working that way, where like you do it yourself like originally, and you put in like the time to kind of like create some of those like standards that you can then more easily hand off.
What I've seen a lot of is that people that are starting their own business, like I had a previous business that was successful, but I was basically starting over. So like I pretty much had to learn these new skills, or at least I felt I did. And I think that's going to be going forward. That's what needs to happen, is like, if you're a CEO, you probably have some marketing ability, like you have some content ability, you know how to get on video, you know how to do these things. There's a legacy group out there that have already been successful. And so so when you're trying to teach them about these different things, it's just like, maybe they're already successful and they just don't see why they would need to do it, or just it's a lot of work, so why do it? But I think that's the key, is like you kind of know how to do it yourself and you can kind of teach other people. And then once you have enough money, maybe you can hire these strategic people that really know LinkedIn really well and help you just nail it and execute on it really well. But those people that can really come into a company and help you execute a plan like that, number one, it's only going to work if you have a good product anyway, and like they're going to be really expensive. So like for most of us, I think you kind of have to learn how to do it. And it sets a good example for everyone else anyway in the company, because like you're telling them to do something and you have the ability to kind of like guide them and do it. But yeah, I think that's one of the hard parts, is that sometimes you end up putting in a bunch of time learning some of these things and nothing really happens because you're just learning. So sometimes you invest a lot of time in a video and like just nothing happens with it. It's just not a good video or whatever. And
yeah,
you have to walk away and kind of just say, well, why wasn't it, And usually it's just because you overthought it and it got too far removed from the listener. But
yeah, I think I heard like more of those common roadblocks, like to scaling content, like in what you're just saying of, we mentioned product, right? Like you have to just start with a good product, right? And that comes from those feedback loops, and it comes from being in those communities of like, what do I need to create? What do people want, right? Is there a market for it? So it starts with that. But then some other challenges I think are people not wanting to like do the hard work initially, right? Like, and sort of like learn some of these things for themselves, because you're not going to be a good teacher and you're not going to be able to onboard well if you don't know what good looks like, right? Or if you don't know what you want. Like it's impossible to onboard someone if like you don't know what you want and if you can't communicate that, right? And so I've noticed, like in talking to now like a few founders, early stage, right? And learning how much of that early process that they do. Like talk to one that's like been creating like his own YouTube videos, and it takes like hours and hours and hours, like every week. He writes the full script, like is the person that sits down like you do and like looks directly in the camera, has to do a bunch of takes, right? It responds to all the comments, like he's doing all of that up front, knowing that that'll help him scale it later, and like he'll become an expert in this product that he's selling that he wasn't initially an expert in, if that makes sense. Like
yeah,
the expertise of the product.
Yeah, plus if you have the right attitude, like what's weird is that if you put in all that extra effort in the beginning, you really get good. Like I'm a much better writer. I don't consider myself a good writer because I'm dyslexic and I make all these spelling and grammar mistakes all the time. But I'm a much better writer. I'm a much better at doing video. I used to be afraid of it. But if the longer you put off just making really good stuff, the longer it's just going to take. And you might get discouraged along the way and just quit because it's not working, right? So I was always operating from a perspective that I knew it worked. So even when I failed and kind of fumbled along, like I was like, well, I got to figure this out. I have to. Like, there's no other choice. I'm not going to go back to like building my business in a networking group where I like am in a room with all these like, 60-year-old guys. Just I had to say 60 because I'm 45 now, and I realized that if I said 45, I'd be the same age. Yeah, so I had to figure it out. So I kept going, but not everyone is like that.
Yeah, and I think realizing, however you choose to scale, you talked about this at the beginning too, like there's challenges which with each platform, right? Which with each channel, like whichever way you decide to go. So knowing that there's no easy way, I think realizing that up front, right? Like it's not going to be easy. So which hard path, like would I rather take? Like which one seems less hard to me and less annoying? So a couple things for you were like, I'm not very interested in like doing the things that I need to do for LinkedIn to work as well as I want it to, right? So I'm going to go over here to these other ones. And yeah, same thing with this other thing of like, I have to learn this myself because I don't want to have to, rely on other people or like, let's sort of like create these connections or being with all these 60-year-olds, these old people. So whatever like your motivation is, like finding that and recognizing that it's not going to be easy no matter what, but there might be an easier way for you that better fits kind of your sort of skill sets.
Yeah, and then I think if your goal is always to like try to make an impact with somebody, then that's a good North Star as well. And that'll help make better content. It'll help you do it faster. And then as you start to scale, then it'll continue to work for you.
Yeah. So we talked a little bit about sort of like some of those logistics in terms of like what you need to do starting out, and it's not scaling. And that's one of the mistakes people make is like trying to immediately scale when they don't understand like what it is that they're scaling, or what it is that works, right? And so, and part of the ways that one way that you can get there is either you have to be a really good communicator and you have to have like done this manually enough that like you can kind of recognize what good looks like, or maybe you're just naturally a good writer, like, and you can just kind of shortcut that. So knowing if that's a strength for you may or may not like let you shortcut this first step. But if you don't know that you're a great writer, or like you don't know which medium's going to work well for you, then there is a little bit of a volume play, right? To be like, I'm going to try a few things, like a few different formats. I'm going to like see one, like what resonates with other people, but also like what works for me. And you mentioned like, video and speaking directly into a camera. And I think about what I've heard people talk about for extroverts, I think, well, this could be introverts too, but this idea of like talking to think, right? Like, and other people like, think to talk, right? But some people, like myself included, sometimes it's just like rambling on for a little bit, and like 30 minutes in, I'm like, oh, there's something, right? Like I didn't have that clarity in my brain before, or I didn't know that it was there until I said it, right? And so sometimes I think being on video, just like talking it out, basically can help you kind of like come up with like your messaging and your kind of gold nuggets in there. So figuring out if that's your formula. I think Chris Walker has talked about this before, and it seems like that's kind of been like a realization for you. Sometimes for me, it's like, it's writing too. Like sometimes I write to think to some degree. Like I have to kind of like sit down, get the garbage out, like write a few paragraphs that are like nothing. And then like, by paragraph like 3, it's like, oh, that's it. Like, that's what I was trying to say. Right. And being able to do that enough where you recognize that those first 2 paragraphs are garbage, right? Or the first 2 lines are garbage. And those are some of like the channel things that you realize too, of just like what works well for the channel too.
Yeah. And I think for the most part, like what I find is people are just, they end up saying stuff that's not really relevant to the other person, or it's more selfish. It's like really more like you trying to be creative, and but to the other person it's just fluff. Now there are some of those creative thinkers that can write like that, where it's truly entertaining and everyone's like looking for every word, but I don't know that I know I'm not that person. So for me, it's just like, what can I remove so that my message is clear? Because what I've realized is like, especially on social media, it's just like the message has to be super clear, like in terms of what you're trying to say to someone. And then also like realizing that maybe your product solves multiple pain points, but if you talk about all of them at once, So yeah, I guess like learning how to reduce things down. And that was one thing going back to why I left LinkedIn to a degree, is like, I can find that because you have these groups of people that kind of support each other, whether it's arranged or not, like, I think it can do you a disservice if you're getting a lot of validation from people that aren't going to buy your stuff, right? Yeah. Maybe you got a bunch of likes and you have this long copy that everyone's like, yeah, that's awesome. But like, maybe that actually sends you the wrong direction, because you're getting all this validation from your friends and your colleagues, but none of those people are going to buy from you. So
yeah, well, maybe this is that next step, right? Of like so you're either a good communicator, or you have a volume play, you look at the feedback, and then you iterate based on that. But then you also have like the proper measurement in place. So you mentioned like with your content, like which content brings in revenue, right? Like, like where your actual customers are coming from, right? And so paying more attention to that, right? Like then kind of some of the like noise, and but also understanding like, that some things are leading metrics, right? So understanding like what's an actual like leading metric, right? And what's kind of just like noise and fluff, and like where the actual customer is coming from. So having that measurement piece in, and the feedback loops, like to iterate that content sort of like as you go. And then we mentioned things like folders and like organization, in terms of like, you can set it up sort of like manually. And then it's a matter of like, okay, it's just a matter of like moving things to folders, right? Or like, once you know all of the people that need to be involved in the process, it's like, how do I plug these things in, right? Like, how do I notify like each of the people at each of the stages, and how do I move content from like one bucket to the next bucket, right? And that's just a matter of automation. So that kind of like completes the loop in terms of like, just very like, this is a very, very simplified version, like of how to think about starting to like scale some parts of your content process. But I don't know, anything else that I missed there in terms of like the big picture, how you think about each step?
No, I mean, I think that's the core of it all. I think, The only like kind of like remaining thought I had about why I do like platforms like TikTok and YouTube specifically, because like I like that I can sit down and craft something and pretty easily test whether it's resonating with the audience. Like I liked that kind of instant feedback. Like I can put it out on TikTok, and if it gets 200 views, then I know it was just average. If I can get a couple thousand, then I know I did something a little bit better. If I can get 20,000, I know I really broke through somewhere, and I can analyze that pretty quickly. And then on YouTube, I know that if I sit down and I make a better YouTube video, like I script it, I think about it, I articulate it, every time it does better.
Yeah.
And I like that.
I mean, this whole thing is to create a sustainable process, right? Like not just you can create a process in theory, right? But like you mentioned, like showing your process to someone else, like may not resonate with them, because it's like, they might think, oh, I know that I'm not going to do this every day, right? And so like being honest with yourself and being like, what is a good process for me? And so that momentum for like works well for me too. It's just like the instant like endorphin rush, right? Of things working. And again, it goes back to the volume of like, you wouldn't know those numbers if you didn't have your own baseline. And if you've done it enough times that you're like, okay, I know, 200 is average. I know 1,000 is good. I know like 20,000 is like crushing it, and it's kind of an outlier. So like, those things for yourself because you've done it enough times, right? You can't just say like Chris Walker or these other people who have been doing this every day for years, like their baselines are different, right? And so you have to have that volume to be able to even set your own baselines, especially because you'll have your own niche too, right? And so like that, your niche might be smaller and like your total addressable market might be smaller, right? And that's not necessarily bad.
Well, one other thing I would say on the argument for quantity as well is like one thing I do realize, like especially if I'm ever helping somebody that just getting started, like because I've thrown out so many pieces at this point, like I do have a little bit of a thick skin. Like I'll throw something out there even if I don't, like maybe I shouldn't, but sometimes those things work well too. And so like it does kind of give you a thick skin to like just throw more things out there, because in all reality, like, I mean, nobody's really paying that much attention to it.
Yeah,
So
I say this all the time with social, like the good and bad thing is it resets. Like every day it resets, right? So it's just like, yeah, like I failed yesterday, right? Like it bombed or something, but it'll reset tomorrow, right? And so like you get a clean slate.
Yeah, and so like I think you'll do better on LinkedIn, like if you do have like a true like focus and purpose. Like I think the reason why Chris Walker did so well is just because like the way like he is out there engaging with people, but not for the sake of engagement. Like if you see like a lot of his comments, they're pretty like, he's really taking a stand against somebody and just saying like this is crap advice.
They all go back to like your ethos, right? You're like your point of view, like on a matter, right? And so then it's helpful because it reaffirms like what it is that you're doing, what it is that you stand for, right?
Right. So if you don't have a point of view yet, like LinkedIn could be a real confusing place.
Yeah, I think that's fair. Like, and so knowing like the different advantages of different places and like maybe where you can experiment, like maybe sometimes having like a burner account to some degree, right? Like where you have a channel where it's just like, this is like my experimentation channel, and thinking about it that way takes some of the pressure off too. All right. So going back to logistics in general of tools, like, so just if you want to kind of like throw out like some of the key tools, like in the process in creating a good content process.
Yeah. So like to me, like having a database. So I use Airtable for that. It's one product out there that kind of simulates a real database. Like there's other project management tools like ClickUp and Notion and all these other tools, but because they're not true databases, like when you get down to the granularity of like tracking every little piece of content that's going through the system and being able to track, what folder it is, like its actual ID, like it's, like if you look at the URL of a file on a Google Drive, there's an actual ID there. And Airtable is good at tracking all that minutia of all the content. And then Zapier is good at like interacting with Airtable and allowing you to automate things on Google Drive and create folders. And between like if you just really boil it down, if you have Airtable, Zapier, and Google Drive, those three things as a unit, you can get that organization and start building workflow with, because like Airtable is really like a spreadsheet. That's really what it is. It's like a database / spreadsheet. And so you can filter the content based off of like different statuses and different workflows. And so you can essentially build out workflow in Airtable. and then you've got Google Drive and Zapier kind of keeping you organized. And just like if we were to boil it down, just those three tools together are pretty powerful.
Nice. Yeah, I think those are nice, like foundational tools, and like some no code, like you mentioned before this call too, of like anyone can figure it out. There's going to be a learning curve, like, but these are no code tools, like both Zapier and Airtable. For people who aren't familiar with something like Airtable, though, you mentioned kind of like, yeah, souped up spreadsheet. Why not like a Google Sheets, right? Or why not like an Excel?
Yeah, so Google Sheets works, I mean, technically, but there's just not as much automation that you can do on it. So like Airtable just like, so the I guess data integrity is an important part. So like with your Google Sheet, just based off of the limitations on what the automations can do, like you're gonna just end up with a really messy Google Sheet after a while. And if you think about what's cool about being organized with content, it's like, well, having all of that content nicely organized and having integrity to it is important, right? Because if you want to come back and search for something later and pull it up easily, then the integrity of your data is important. And so I can just guarantee you, if you use Google Sheets at some point, it's just going to become a mess, and you'll stop trusting it. And the trust in your own system is pretty important. So Airtable just really is a real database, has more of that. So I'm a developer, so I've used like actual databases like Postgres and MySQL and all these other true databases. Airtable for no code is just about as close as you can get without it actually becoming something that you have to manage on a AWS server or something like that.
Nice. No, I think that's a good rationale. I wouldn't have thought about data integrity so much. It's more just like the messiness and like the lack of integration.
And you only learn that once you have like once you have like thousands of pieces of content in your database, you're like, hey, this is pretty cool.
Yeah,
like,
or once it's broken, right? Like, well, actually, like one time we did a project, like a partner project, and started it where anyone could add to this Google Sheet, right? But it broke. There are too many people that were like looking at this Google Sheet at one time. So that's another piece of it too, is like, if you're going to build on top of it, if this is your backbone, like of your system, like you don't want it to break either. And so knowing like the limitations of those things.
Yeah, and then Airtable, what's really cool is like we talk a lot about the organization, and that is the key piece. But then once you start integrating with AI and stuff, so like that data integrity is really important, because now I have like a video, I can connect it with an API. I can send it somewhere. I can send that video somewhere, have it come back, tie it back together, and like add more content. Or so like once you start messing with API and all these different API calls, then that even becomes even more important. So like the organization is the key piece, but then once it's organized and everything's stored, you have IDs to these different things. Now you can connect with any of these new APIs that are coming out and send the data there and have it come back with a response. You can send text to Midjourney and have it come back with an image. You can send a long form video to Opus Clips. I think there's problems with some of these things. They're not going to always send you back what you want.
Yeah.
But you're now positioned to actually to use them.
Yeah, that's cool. I mean, if you think about it as like the address, like for this content, right? Yeah, like
right.
Like here's where I live, right? And so the ability to be able to share that address, like with other tools and automate and cross collaborate with some of these things, makes sense. The other question I had was, so project management, is Airtable good enough like for project management, or do you also use a tool for that to kind of get your whole team on the same page?
Yeah, so where I kind of draw the line is like all my content management is in Airtable. If I have other projects and stuff that I want to run, I may not use Airtable. I would say the disadvantage with Airtable is that it feels like a database, and so like when you're managing a team and stuff like that, you could definitely make it work, but sometimes like tools like Monday.com or ClickUp or Notion, they might work a little bit better for just like pure project management. But for like content management, like I run everything through that. So like managing all of the upcoming events. So I kind of like started to realize, okay, there's events that I plan. I'm going to record this. I'm going to write this. So anything that I'm going to record in the future is like a recording event. Then I'll and you'll start to see that when you kind of go into the content engine database. But there's like essentially you're planning things out in the future, and then things are processed and then distributed. Anything in that realm I use Airtable for, to keep it all organized. Because once you start to have multiple systems, then everything kind of starts to break down. And
nice. So when you're assigning to a team member, do you usually assign in Airtable, like if it's a content task? Okay. So
The
it still
content task,
works decent, like for you for project management. So that's interesting.
yeah. As long, for the content side of things, yeah, for sure.
Okay.
Yeah, like there was a time I remember when we interacted a year or two ago. I used two different systems, and then eventually I just kind of got rid of that and just used one.
Yeah, that's what I was curious about, because there's going to be a redundancy if you do that, right? Like it's going to feel like, why am I using two tools that overlap this much, right? So figuring out like if you can consolidate, it's almost always. And then the other piece of this is like you mentioned social channels. So do you have automations set up like to be able to push like directly to those social channels and
I do, yeah.
using those as tools?
Yeah, but anything that I want to grow on, I don't auto post it. So like we don't auto post to TikTok or anything like that. Every time I do that, I can see a dramatic difference.
That's a good tip for people, I think, is like which things to automate, basically. Which things to automate, and like which tools are your foundational tools and which feel like they're needed but aren't necessarily.
Yeah, and so like what's kind of interesting and painful about all of this is that there's a lot of context and nuance to all of it. Right? So do you have the manpower to post manually everywhere? Then do it. It's going to benefit you. Maybe you don't have that, but that takes a lot of time to post all of this stuff to every single platform. So if some of these platforms are kind of more just like, I'm there and I'm available to network there if I need to, then, and I'm not really trying to grow followers and get views there, then it's important. Because I have lots of people that do go over to Instagram and find me and message me there. It's just, or they go to LinkedIn, they found me on TikTok. So I have a lot of that cross-pollination. So it's good that I'm there. Excuse me. But
there's a difference between like where you want to be visible, and maybe it's like for your strategy, it sounds like be visible as many places as possible, but double down or like build community in these certain channels, which have kind of been more proven out in terms of like driving customers, frankly.
Yeah, and plus have your own actual community. So like I have that community on school. Like that's a cool place to actually nurture people, and like people talk about community. It's so broad in like how people talk about it. You could say your social media following is your community. It's fine, but like I think if you think about real communities, like what I think about is usually like just more traditional. Like you've got your hometown, and there's like groups of people that get together and really help each other, right? So if you're really trying to build a community, that should probably be your focus. Like how are you really bringing people together that where you're not even necessarily, maybe you're kind of the ringleader, but people are helping each other. That's probably like a better metric of success for a good community, is like people are actually like, without you involved, they're interacting and helping each other.
That's interesting. Yeah, because I do think about like social and places where people already are and where there's like less friction as like a good place to start building audience and community and things like that. But it is a bigger ask to ask someone to like come into your community, right, and be a part of like what you're doing. And that probably shows more intent, right? Both like more intent to buy, more intent to be aligned with the mission, right? Like, yeah, and just getting like the same sort of like-minded people together like should sort of benefit everybody, right? So there's like a lot of value, and if you can do that, it means you're onto something.
Yeah, you have to have a lot of patience, because especially if you're new to social media, you're going to get on there and you're going to be bombarded with all this advice on what you should do. And I'll be honest, it's super confusing. So like context, like I remember listening to Chris Walker a bunch of times, and until you kind of understood the things he was talking about, because sometimes he's talking about like paid ads for like super like huge startups, like it's like, that's not relevant to me and you. Well, maybe it is to you depending on what job you have, but like that's definitely not relevant to me, but then sometimes he's talking about how he's growing his firm, and that's super relevant. And then you got all these other people talking about what they're doing, and so you're going to have some patience. That's why I think having your own purpose, like that's going to be like so good in terms of just ignoring things, but you're going to have some patience as these things kind of like mature as well, because like if you're just starting out, like nobody's going to care about your email, nobody's going to care about your community, nobody's probably going to even care about your content, because it's just not really that relevant to them yet, or you just don't have enough expertise. And so scaling or doing any of these things is just not going to matter. So having patience to kind of like have this stuff unfold is important. And then that purpose, I think, will give you direction in all that chaos,
Yeah, having the patience to create something worth scaling and create something that you are willing to scale, like frankly, that you're willing to like stick with, right? That is when things start getting exciting too, because then it's like you have something that you're passionate about, you could do long term, and that really has like the legs to like have long term growth, right? So I think that's a great takeaway. I've gone like super long with this because I have really enjoyed this conversation. But sort of last question is just any other advice you'd give, a content leader or someone looking to kind of scale their content at this stage?
So there's a difference between like all the services you could sell and what you want to get traction on social media. So I think when you do have a niche and you go deep on something, it's easier to stick through on stuff. So like I think having a focus and being willing to talk about things that are more narrow than maybe what your actual product suite has is a real good advantage in the beginning, because it just ends up being more relevant and more specific. And so therefore it can be easier to stand out. Whereas if you try to talk about multiple things, it's just going to be confusing to people. And I see this like on LinkedIn a lot, and it's probably not necessarily relevant to everybody, but you'll see people that are like, they have a corporate job, but they're also LinkedIn strategists, and they, and then it's just very confusing as to like what they're even there for. So I think having a niche, that's what's allowed me to grow my current business, is just being in something that kind of nobody else really talks about as in depth as I do.
Yeah, this is perfect because I mean, I can vouch for what it is that you do, because I've purchased like Steven's course and watched his YouTube videos, so I highly recommend folks go and check those out. He really does like walk through some of the things that I think the average content marketer is either not great at, or it's not like the first thing to do, right? The first thing is always like, how do we create the content? How do you distribute the content? And then it's like, oh man, like this is really working. How do we like increase our output, right? How do we increase our volume? And so it starts getting messy around that time. And so I reached that stage myself. And so it's a matter of like, okay, how can I duplicate myself, right? Like how do you find ways to kind of clone yourself, like in a way? And yeah, super interested in this topic right now. And I think it's going to become more and more popular, especially as like we get more leverage out of AI and out of these like automation tools. And so yeah, definitely recommend checking out Content Engine from Steven, and then just look up his name like on YouTube too, and just binge all the content ops and become really good at that.
It is kind of cool too. Like if you go to YouTube and you type content automation, like my video comes up top.
There you go. So it's like, what do you want to be known for, right? Like that's like the whole point of this.
Yeah, you pick something and you kind of go deep on it. And I've made little mistakes along the way where I wasn't sure about this or like that, and they all of those like hesitations, they all hurt me. If I had listened to my purpose and my passions and like what I was really good at, I probably would have been able to shortcut this process for myself. So
yeah, it's scary just going in like all in on one thing. And I'll say like
it really is
on the job front too. Like, and this is I recently posted about this of like at every stop, like I basically asked a manager about like what are my strengths and weaknesses, right? Like it's uncomfortable sometimes because you're going to get like some negative feedback too, right? Or sometimes it hurts to be like, I thought I was really good at this and like they think I'm not good at this, but it's helpful to know like how you're perceived, right? Like, because that's how your audience perceives you too, like, and the people that know you best, like ask what it is that you're best at, be honest with yourself about like what you're best at, but then also, what do you like doing, and trying to find like that intersection that's where you should double down probably. So
and your gut usually tells you, but we just like, I like the opportunity of social media. I think it's pretty cool that you can reach all these niche audiences. So you can have a product now that you wouldn't have been able to have 15 years ago because you just wouldn't have been able to find the number of people to buy it. But now you can. Now the only disadvantage is you're bombarded with all this stuff. And so if you don't have like some sort of core gut feeling and purpose and vision, like you're going to get beat around. There's only a few types of people out there that I've ever found that they're purely opportunists. And I'm not saying that in a negative way. They're purely opportunists and they're really sensitive and they just see a hole in the market and they attack it and they benefit from it. And they're only there to make money. There's a few types that are like that. And if you're like that, you could probably do pretty well on social media just by like hacking something, using tactical things to get something. But other than that, like you have to have some kind of gut feeling and passion and purpose and vision to make all this stuff really work long term.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. So last question, where can folks find you?
Yeah, probably the best place like is the community. So if you go to school and it's with a K, skool.com/content-academy. That's like the place where you can like interact and get help and post things. I'll help you do things. And I've got free courses on automation and creating content. And then otherwise, if you go to Google and you type Stephen G. Pope, then you can find me on any of your favorite platforms, YouTube, LinkedIn, all those things will pop up. So that's the other way. And Stephen with a PH.
Perfect. Yeah. And once again, like I can vouch for it. I'm in that community. I'm surprised just like how many smarter people than me are in that are specifically like wired for content operations, like, you know, how to get more leverage out of a piece of content, how to work faster. So it's really good if you want to kind of round out in that area. All right, Stephen, I know really enjoyed this conversation. That's the reason it's long. So we'll talk soon.
See ya.
Thanks for listening to Content Logistics. This episode was produced by Motion, a done-for-you B2B podcasting agency for busy marketers. If you liked what you heard, please follow the show on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts.